In this short video, we're going to be painting this mountain landscape featuring rocks. Roll that intro. Welcome back to the studio. My name's Andrew. If you're new here, this is the place where I talk about all things to do with oil painting, so consider subscribing. Now, in this little mountain painting, I'm going to be really focusing on rocks, but if you want to see the full version of this painting tutorial, you can find that right now on my Patreon page. This is the first of many monthly tutorials that are going to be going up on Patreon. So if you want to find out more information about that, you can find that by clicking the link in the description down below. But in this short video, and in the time we have together right now, I just want to focus on those rocks, in particular, how to create a crispy, detailed surface and really render a three-dimensional form. It comes down to the quality of the paint that we're using and the texture, as well as our color and tone. For this demonstration, I'm using Blue Ridge handmade oil colors. My palette does change throughout this demonstration. I'll explain a bit about what those colors are, but if you want to find the set that I use for any of my paintings, you can find that by clicking the link in the description down below as well. This scene is located near Kinloch in the South Island of New Zealand, not too far from Queenstown. There's a short hike through a majestic forest, and then it opens up to this amazing alpine amphitheater. I just love those mountains that stretch into the distance, and that light pouring in from the top right. But what I really enjoy are all of these rocks and boulders in the immediate foreground, and that beautiful crystalline stream snaking its way through. So I gathered heaps of reference material on the day, and I'm really looking forward to getting stuck into this painting. I sketch out my composition freehand on this 13 by 17 inch homemade Belgian linen panel. Now I'm going to work a little different than I normally do, starting with solidifying the composition here in the foreground, which is different than the way I normally work, starting with those distant reaches and then working my way forward. Here, I thought I'd take a bolder approach. So I get those dark patches firmly established in the foreground before progressing with the painting. Now my darkest shadows are a combination of that burnt umber and ultramarine blue, and I'm allowing for a bit of cooler blue to come through to reflect some of that skylight shining from above. I'm adding about 20 to 25% liquid original into my mixes here on the block end, and this is going to allow the subsequent layers of the brushwork to key in and really adhere nicely. To achieve any level of realism, it's about layering that paint and getting one layer over another to add to the richness of the surface. I keep the block end pretty thin and then begin to add to the texture of the paint as I'm adding those layers. To add thickness and body to the paint, I'm mixing in a touch of liquid impasto medium. Now there's a general rule of thumb when it comes to painting rocks, and that is to keep the shadows relatively thin and keep those highlights relatively thick. I use synthetic brushes for the shadow portion, like I'm painting here, and I'm using bristle brushes for those highlight portions. Now, naturally, the difference in the fibers will make a different kind of mark and reflect varying amounts of light back to the viewer. So thicker paint reflects more light, thinner paint reflects less light. So we can use this to our advantage when rendering those three-dimensional forms. Now, if that particular rock painting technique sounds hard to you, not to worry. Practice makes perfect. Once you get the hang of it, your paintings will totally be the shist. It is vitally important to have good reference material when we're trying to paint something relatively complicated such as this. Now I'm referring to this image in particular for this section of the painting. One of the things I'm noticing is that there's actually an abundance of light everywhere within the scene, not just the highlight as well. So to get these forms to look three-dimensional, I'm also paying very close attention to reflected light, which is coming from that sky above. Now here you can really see how much thick paint I'm using for building up the surface of the rock. And again, those bristle brushes, in particular old and frayed bristle brushes, are great for carrying this technique. I go back and readjust some of the ridge lines that are left in those brush strokes to make sure that they're following with the grain of the quartz of these particular boulders. I'm going to let this layer of paint completely dry before coming back over the top with any detail. By layering the paint one layer over another, working over dried layers. That is what allows the texture to really come out. Again, even though I say this quite a bit in my videos, it's important to never go above that ratio of 25% of medium mixed into our paint, or 1 part medium to 3 parts paint. So I'm using the same ratio with Liquid Impasto as I am with Liquid Original and even Liquid Fine Detail. Not observing this rule will lead to cracking, disadhesion, or yellowing down the track. It's a very important rule. We shouldn't take it for granted. Too many puns? Okay. No worries, I hear you. Let's start with a clean slate and begin to work here in the foreground water. And I'm going to be mixing up a nice green color, which is a combination of transparent yellow oxide, ultramarine blue, cobalt teal, and a touch of yellow ochre as well. I just love that crystalline appearance of this glacial snow melt water. It's really beautiful. So what we're going to do is start off with whatever's lying underneath the surface of that water and begin to build it up layer by layer, just as we're doing with the rocks. I'm just brushing this color in very loosely, elongating some of those rocky forms in accordance with refraction. Now let's go ahead and block in this little waterfall that's just poking its way behind one of these boulders here. And I'm going to mix up a color that looks pretty close to pure white, but I'm holding back with my tones. Again, if we want to create the illusion of light within our paintings, it makes good sense to hold back from the top of our tonal range. So I've knocked this down ever so slightly with burnt umber and ultramarine blue to form a light gray. We'll come back and detail that waterfall later on. So keeping careful control of our tones is essential, but the other thing we want to focus on when painting rocks is the quality of our edges. I'm paying very close attention to where a form is much rounder, so I blend that edge slightly, and in some areas I try to maintain a really sharp edge. Again, the brush can do so much to really helping achieve this effect. So again, for those shadows, I'm using plenty of synthetics, and for those highlights, I'm using mainly bristle brushes. To achieve some more precision, here in some of the shadow recesses of these rocks, I'm using ivory daggers and synthetic pointed rounds. Now these help me achieve an exact, precise mark, and so I can just chip away at that rock surface. I'm using Liquid Fine Detail for these shadow portions of the rocks. This is allowing me to create thinner marks. So in looking at my reference material, I'm noticing that there's some really interesting midtones coming through in the shadowed portions, as well as some deeper shadows. So creating this chattered effect with these thin marks made by the synthetic brushes and thin paint given by that Liquid Fine Detail. Of course, building up the surface like this does take a lot of time. It's just a slow, methodical approach, one brushstroke at a time. Now, of course, there are many different approaches to painting rocks. This is just how I roll. Now, when that fresh paint is deposited over that dried, textured surface, what happens is the paint is accumulated along the tops of those ridge lines, and it's left out of the bottom recesses or valleys in those brush strokes, creating a much richer and gnarly surface. So it's absolutely essential that we let these layers of paint dry between applications. Now the painting here at this shot is completely dry from that previous pass, so I come back over the top with a 00 synthetic pointed round and begin to add even thicker paint of a lighter tone. Again, pretty far away from the top of my tonal range, but I've mixed in just a touch of cobalt teal and quinacridone magenta to give it a cool tinge, to allow some of that quartz crystal to be shining through, which is glinting in the sunlight. Again, that Liquid Impasto medium really helps for this technique, and I continually go back and reload my brush. By reloading the brush constantly, it allows me to deposit an exact amount of paint, just accumulated along the ends of those bristles. Now, it's important when you're painting something so detailed and you're really concentrating on your techniques to take the time to stand back and view the painting from a distance to make sure the detail is reading from about 10 feet away. This is normally the distance that I like people to view the paintings, but here you're seeing something that is very, very much up close. But as soon as we step back, it solidifies and we can actually see the effectiveness of our technique. It crystallizes in front of our eyes. Now, over these dried rocks, I'm going to apply some glazes. Really handy colors for this are transparent red oxide and transparent yellow oxide, like I'm applying right here. Now, the transparency is perfect because it means that we're going to just, in a translucent way, affect the colors, but still be able to see what's lying underneath. Now, it helps using liquid fine detail for this technique, and again, keep that medium to an absolute minimum by using only about 20 to 25%. Again, I keep going on about that, but I want your paintings to last for a very long time, as I would like mine to last for a long time as well. And most of the problems that us oil painters run into is all due to abusing our medium. Everything starts off more or less as a mid-tone when painting rocks, and then I begin to carve away at that surface, making those grooves even deeper with much darker tone, and then continually adding to the highlights. And this is why it makes so much sense to save our tonal best for last. So it's not only true for those brightest brights, but also for our darkest darks. I have several brushes on the go at any one time, several used just for those highlights and midtones, being that synthetic pointed round. I've got one for the shadow to start carving away at the backside of the rock, and then one for those highlights as well. This allows me to achieve clean color throughout the process. It also helps to continually wipe off the brush on a piece of paper towel as you're applying these techniques and maintain that clean color. Now let's get back to that water in the foreground. This layer is now completely dry. I'm going to go back and knock in some of the darker darks that are left by those shadows of the stones just sitting below that water surface. I've mixed up a combination of phthalo green and ultramarine blue and toned this down with plenty of burnt umber. It's a pretty dark color, but I'm brushing this on relatively thin and smearing between some of those strokes to create a painterly effect. I'll let this completely dry before revisiting that water again. Now the rocks are dry once again, time for another pass and for some of that brightest bright to be going on to some of these boulders. And this is pretty much pure titanium white for its opacity, transparent yellow oxide, and just a touch of yellow ochre as well to give that color some warmth. I've mixed in a bit of liquid impasto medium to maintain some of the thickness. I use only pure white when it comes to painting water or the sparkles on the surface of water, and this is what allows that water to glisten and come to life. Now those rock shadows that we were applying in the water are now completely dry, and it's time for the final pass on the surface here. I'm using a nice vibrant violet color given by quinacridone magenta and ultramarine blue, a touch of that liquid fine detail, and brushing that over some of the shadows, and then finally applying some pinpoints of light to the surface. Now there may have been a few rock puns in this video, and no, I'm not stoned, I just wanted to have fun with it. If you made it this far and you've come away with a new technique or two, you totally rock.
Well, I really hope you've enjoyed this little video and you've come away with a couple of new techniques. If you want even more information on how I painted this scene, then make sure you find that full tutorial on my Patreon page by clicking that link in the description down below. This is the first of many monthly tutorials that are going to be going on my Patreon page, so if that sounds like you, then consider joining me there. Now, if you like this video, make sure you click the like button, leave me a comment down below, but make sure you're subscribed to this channel and click that notification bell so you're notified when I upload another tutorial. Thank you so much for joining me. It has been an absolute pleasure to have your company here once again. I'll see you again very, very soon.